So in Chapter 7, we talked about reliability. So in Chapter 8, we will explore validity. So in talking about the idea of validity, validity is this idea of how much the test measures what it's actually supposed to measure. So in reliability, we talked about the outcome of the assessment being reliable, so the same over time. So meaning that the way that we administer, interpret, and understand the outcome of an assessment is the same over time. With validity, we're looking at the actual content. We're looking at the actual assessment and the protocols in place and how that's been developed to make sure that whatever it's supposed to measure is what it actually measures. So if I want to give my client an assessment for ADHD, I need to make sure that the content of that assessment actually looks at elements of ADHD. So if it asks about a bunch of other things, then it may be reliable because it may come out the same way every time, but it's not really valid because it's not really exploring the different constructs and variables that would relate to ADHD diagnosis. So this is how much a test or an assessment measures the thing that it's supposed to or designed to measure. And so we're looking at the way that you use and interpret the results, not the actual results themselves. So we're not looking at how many times somebody can take a test and how much variance there is in the outcomes of that test. We're looking at, do the outcomes of the test actually tell me anything meaningful about the purpose of why I used it in the first place? So we have these idea of constructs that we've talked about already. Again, these are the elements or ideas that explain behavior. And then we use variables as ways to explore those constructs or describe pieces of those constructs, because it's really hard to just describe behavior. It's a pretty abstract concept. And so there might be different variables that when we put together would tell the story of that construct, would tell the story of that behavior or be able to capture that behavior. So the relationship between validity and reliability, a test can be reliable but not valid, which means that a test can come out the same way every time you take it, but not be particularly meaningful. But an unreliable test is not ever a valid test. So if we have too much variance in the scores, then it's not really going to be a valid test anyway, because we can't even depend on the way that it's administered and scored to even make meaning of understanding what it would tell us about that particular construct. So again, relating to this idea of constructs, which are not specific to validity, but are important in a lot of aspects of assessment development. But constructs are these ideas that describe or explain behavior. And so we use variables to help measure different pieces of constructs. And then when we put the variables together into a single construct, we can hopefully capture things like intelligence, things like anxiety and depression and ADHD and these kinds of things. And so these constructs can be very comprehensive and complex. So think about things like personality traits. So there would be a whole lot of different variables that we would look at to make up that single construct. Or they can be kind of narrowly defined and specific. So think about mood. There's a couple of examples of anxiety and depression inventories, suicide ideation. These kinds of things are very narrow and specific. So it can be one or the other. And that just would change the number of variables that would be involved in the way that we would measure a certain construct. And so the results that we get from any kind of assessment should accurately represent that construct, which is what makes it a valid instrument. So clearly validity is really important in assessment, and we would want all of our instruments or our tests or assessments that we are using to have good validity. And so when you're developing an instrument, you have to look at all of these different potential threats to the validity of your instrument that you're developing. And when I talk about instrument, it's another way of saying test or assessment. So a couple of these are things like construct underrepresentation or construct irrelevant variance. And so If, for example, the instrument measures less of the construct than it's supposed to, that would be underrepresentation. So the things that it's measuring don't accurately capture the construct and therefore threatens the validity of the instrument. On the other side of things, construct irrelevant variance means that it captures too much. So the different variables involved are really too broad to paint an accurate picture of the construct that we're trying to examine. Then there are some other factors within the test that can make a difference. So if wording is ambiguous, if the different variables included are inappropriate or don't connect well enough, if the way that things are worded or constructed or ordered don't make sense, if there aren't enough questions or items on the inventory, a lot of different kinds of ways that the test is constructed and designed can threaten the validity of the instrument. Further, we might look at instrument administration and scoring. So, for example, if the directions are not clear or someone doesn't follow them in the correct sort of way, using things like time limits that don't really give someone enough time to accurately fill out the test, giving test takers unfair help. So thinking about, a great example would be like standardized testing like the ACT or the SAT or the LSAT or the GRE. And so there's been common criticism of these assessments that a threat to validity with those is the fact that you can take a test prep course and then do better. And so the idea of these tests is there's some sort of achievement or aptitude test. So either measuring your ability to perform well in graduate school, measuring your ability to perform well in college, measuring your ability to perform well in law school. However, if I can pay some test-taking company and go take a really expensive preparatory course, or on an LSAT, pay extra money to use my laptop in the test, and then do better, not necessarily because I have any more potential to do well in school, but just because if those factors influence the outcome of the test, it threatens the validity of the test in the first place. It threatens how much it actually captures my ability to do well in school, which is what that construct that's supposed to be measured by that aptitude test, right? So things like that can impact the validity of tests as well. Test taker characteristics. So again, things like test anxiety, lack of motivation, maybe you're tired, maybe you're uncomfortable, maybe something's happened to you that day and you're not able to concentrate. All of those kinds of things can threaten the validity of a test. And then an inappropriate test group. So this would be where we start talking about norming groups. And so if the way that the test or instrument was developed was perhaps including mostly Western folks who identify as Caucasian or heterosexual or in these certain kind of majority culture groups. And then, for example, individuals who might identify with more minority cultures take the test. Is that scoring representative of those individuals taking the test that do not fall within those majority culture groups? So inappropriate test groups, meaning that the client that's taking that doesn't necessarily feel represented by the norming group, which would influence the validity of the assessment. And that's a common criticism of instruments, is that they aren't inclusive in terms of the way that they are normed and therefore potentially not valid for certain cultural groups, certain language speaking individuals, those sorts of things. So there are different types of validity also that we might look at. So there used to be this tripartite model of validity, which looked at three different aspects of validity separately. So the first is this content validity, which is how adequately the test or instrument represents the content of the construct, which is the idea that we want to make sure that the content of the assessment captures all aspects of the construct that are necessary, all the variables that we would need. So making sure, for example, with like mood and behavioral disorders that we're capturing both emotional and behavioral symptoms, not just one or the other, which might be a threat to this idea of content validity. So then looking at criterion-related validity, this is the idea of knowing how much the results of this test connect with some sort of other variable associated with the construct. So in other words, knowing how well the score on one kind of outcome might predict a different kind of outcome, how the criterion might connect to each other to accurately represent things like the amount of depression a person might have, or how much depression a person might experience in the future. So we want to know how much different criterion connect with each other within the way that the instrument represents that construct. How much those variables connect with each other to give us an accurate picture of that construct. And then there's construct validity, which is how appropriate it is to infer that a score on a test equals some sort of understanding about human behavior. So this is this idea that we've been talking about all along. So because someone scored a certain number on a depression inventory, is it appropriate to assume that they would meet the other criterion for a diagnosis of depression based on that inventory? So that's kind of the more traditional view of validity. And then more recently, they've brought validity into this unitary model, into this single unified concept that really just centers on this idea of construct validity. And so we would use different sources and different ways to provide evidence that the way that this instrument operates and is scored equals an understanding of the construct that it's supposed to represent. So other evidence of validity includes several other areas of consideration. So one is the test content itself, right? What is in the instrument? So we have to make sure that the test content validity is there. That validity evidence exists. So we have to know, as we've discussed, that the content of the assessment aligns with the variables of the construct, right? So this idea that if we want to measure anxiety, the content needs to probably be built on the diagnostic criteria for anxiety. Same with depression. So you can take a look at on our course page under the assessments, I've listed the Beck Depression Inventory and the Beck Anxiety Inventory, and you can see how the content of these two aligns with the DSM criteria for major depressive disorder, for anxiety disorders. So we have to make sure that the content aligns with the constructs. Otherwise, we don't really have a valid instrument because we don't know that we're capturing or measuring what's necessary to represent that construct involved. Building on that idea, we need to look at the internal structure. So not just the content, not just the subject material and the way that we're discussing it and representing these constructs, but the actual internal structure. So as we've discussed in previous chapters, in some instruments, there's just one assessment. It's got the questions that it has. You score it. It shows you an outcome. Sometimes you have different components of that. So you might have different subscales that make up an entire assessment or different pieces that measure different aspects of a more complex construct. So looking at different variables that would make up a construct. So we have to look at this idea of internal structure. And so this is where we would use statistically things like factor analysis to look at how these different pieces of an assessment connect with each other to offer this validity idea to the assessment that we're using. So then we have measurement and variance, which looks at all the different aspects of that internal structure. So again, it could be just the one assessment, it could be multiple subscales, but wanting to make sure that it fairly represents the abilities and the views and to some degree the cultural identities of the person that you're having take the assessment as your client. So in the way that the instrument has been developed, not that there needs to be that overall representation, but also in the way that the internal structure of the instrument is designed, we have to make sure that it is inclusive of all levels of ability or all like languages, for example, different kinds of things are considered in the way that it's structured and created as well. And then we, of course, want to look at the reliability, as we talked about in the previous chapter. So not just that the score overall is reliable, but the scores for any kind of subscales or any kind of smaller pieces would be consistent as well. So that's where looking at those kind of split half tests or looking at different subscales and making sure that reliability is there. And in that way, the reliability does have a relationship to validity, as we have already discussed. So we would look at other variables, concurrent versus predictive elements that might be in place. So concurrent meaning, is the validity, is it there currently, and can we use that to predict if an outcome in an assessment really does equal a DSM diagnosis or really does equal a certain IQ score, which would represent someone's like grade level or the ability to get into gifted and talented. So can we use the outcome of an assessment to accurately predict what this person is going to need in their life? So in that way, assessment's really important and validity is really important, because it's not just, I'm going to give you an assessment, I'm going to read you the results. Usually those results have some sort of consequence for somebody's life. It can equal what kind of treatment you have access to, if you're inpatient or outpatient at a certain facility, what kind of resources you have access to, what grade you're going into, if you're in a gifted and talented program, if you're in special education programs. Like, these outcomes of assessments need to be valid because they connect with these constructs, and these constructs connect with some sort of consequence for somebody's life. And so that's why validity is so, so important. So in terms of how we measure validity, we look at validity coefficients, which again relate to this idea of correlation, as we talked about in the reliability chapter previously. So we're looking for two different things. We're looking for false positive, meaning that there is false representation of connection between a construct and an assessment, or a false negative, meaning that it seems like there's not a connection there, but there actually is. And so in terms of looking validity, we're still looking at correlation. So that 0 to 1.0, 1.0 meaning that these things are moving in the same direction in the same sort of way, and 0 meaning there's no relationship there at all. Just in validity, the numbers that make something valid are going to be a bit lower than they are in reliability. And that's because in validity, it's just a bit more complicated. So we're looking at this instrument in comparison to other instruments, or subscales in relation to other subscales. And so you're not likely to have relationships where things are moving in the same way over time together, because we just don't have that consistency between different kinds of instruments. I mean, there might be small differences in the way they measure things, or small differences in the way they characterize a construct. Reliability, we're looking at the same instrument over and over and over again. So we might have higher numbers and higher ways to measure that. But with validity, we're looking more like a 0.5. 0.5 is pretty darn good with validity. So anything from like a 0.49, maybe even like a 0.35 to a 0.50 is pretty good or pretty acceptable. Anything that's below a 0.3, we might want to look for something that's a little bit more valid to make sure that we're actually accurately capturing that construct, because we don't want to accidentally, again, have those false positive or false negative errors, meaning that we're predicting that a positive outcome would happen when it wouldn't, or predicting a negative outcome would happen when it really wouldn't. So we looked at the idea of validity in terms of the entire construct, and now we've talked about relationships, validity amongst different variables. And just a note, my neighbor has decided that this is just the perfect moment to pressure wash the side of his house. And so I'm hoping that you don't necessarily hear the sound of the pressure washer next door. But I apologize if you can hear that. I've tried to kind of find a place in my house that's the quietest so that hopefully you're not able to hear it. So the first area of relationship to other variables we would look at is evidence of homogeneity. And this really looks at how similarly different items or different subscales or different parts of a test or an assessment measure a single kind of concept. So this might be a certain symptom, this might be a certain aspect of a construct, this might be a certain variable. So we want to see if there are different parts of an assessment that are measuring the same type of thing, which hopefully there is, because looking at something from different types of questions or looking at something in different ways helps build validity and reliability, right? We talked about the longer assessments, asking things in different kinds of ways adds that validity and reliability to an assessment in the first place. So we want to make sure that in adding all of these different pieces to a test or an instrument, that they are all measuring things similarly in terms of the way that they are looking at that construct or that variable. So we want to look and see if things like correlation, so if the scores are changing in the same sort of way, not just on the entire instrument, but on different subscales, on different items that are supposed to be looking at the same thing. So if that would make, for example, the score on the entire assessment go up, we would want to see that the score on the subscale was going up as well. So looking at the homogeneity in the way that we are measuring a certain concept with different parts of an assessment or an instrument. Then we have convergent or discriminant evidence. So looking at, again, correlation and seeing if instrument results that we are looking at for our instrument align with those of other instruments that are looking at the same kind of construct. So does our depression inventory, does the outcome of that change in a similar way to other depression inventories? Same with intelligence testing, those kinds of things. So does our instrument vary in outcome in the same way that another was? Even if they're not scored in the same way, we can look at the way that the outcomes change based on someone who has more symptoms or less symptoms or different kinds of things going on as they're taking the assessment. Same with discriminant, same idea, but a bit of a different approach. So we want to see that based on, we want to see a low correlation with things that it's not measuring, right? So there should be a low correlation between the way that the score on my depression inventory changes when we look at the way that scores on an intelligence test changes, right? So they shouldn't have a relationship with each other, but we want to make sure that they don't. So we're not accidentally measuring something that we are not intending to measure. So then we would just look at also differences that might happen based on different types of groups, as we've talked about, perhaps the age of individuals taking the test, and then we would have some options to take a look at ways to look at validity specifically for assessments that would be used to measure the outcome of any kind of psychological experimentation or any kind of research work, right? And so we have that factor analysis that we talked about statistically to take a look at all these different parts of an instrument and see if they're matching up and if they're valid, as opposed to looking at the instrument as a whole. So finally, we just want to look at making sure that our assessment doesn't create any kind of harm. So what are the consequences of someone taking this instrument or this test? So there might be intended consequences, things like learning more about yourself, things like having some sort of DSM diagnosis. So if those are things that are supposed to happen, we want to make sure that based on the outcome of that assessment, those things are happening. So someone would qualify for entry to graduate school, someone would qualify for a certain grade level, someone would qualify for a certain type of diagnosis. And then there's unintended consequences. So we want to make sure that as a result of any kind of assessment, no one has any harm come to them. Nobody goes through any kind of psychological distress that's significant. So making sure that we aren't causing any kind of harm, and that's really an ethics concept, to make sure that we're not hurting anyone in the process of gathering this information. Now, there might be some consequences that are not negative things. So these could be things like drawing attention to education policy by looking at standardized tests. This could be things like advocacy opportunities by assessing what's going on in certain communities and gathering a picture of that. So knowing that, for example, Depression and anxiety impact communities of color more than they do other communities. There are higher rates of substance abuse in lower income communities, those kinds of things. Those provide a catalyst for advocacy opportunities that could be consequences as well. So then, similar to reliability and validity, we also want to look at response processes, so how the different factors involved with the test taker are responding to the test and how that's impacting the test, right? So things like anxiety, things like emotional responses, things like stress level. How are these actions or thoughts or emotions of the test taker being impacted by the test, and how are they impacting the test itself? So the way we would look at that are things like think aloud protocols, so having someone walk you through what it's like to take something, asking afterwards in an interview, and then there are some kind of newer, more techy ways of measuring that through examining brain activity or eye movement to see how individuals are reacting to a test and does that align with what the test is supposed to do.